There's a new documentary that's getting rave reviews from film critics across North America. Sugarcane, a Sundance Film Festival Award winner, picked up for distribution by National Geographic. It should be said that film critics should not have to fact-check documentaries, especially not one with National Geographic's prestigious brand. Priests, incinerated babies, no questions, no one noticed. Until now? Sugarcane has had 100 fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes for weeks. Imagine that all these film critics have been misled. Imagine that all these film critics are spreading a blood libel against the Roman Catholic Church and Canada. Imagine that what the film critics say they saw and heard is not the truth, and key players in the film knew it from the get-go. This is the deception of Sugarcane. Here is the New York Times review. Their conclusion is that the documentary proves infants born to girls were thrown into incinerators. The review from Christian Science Monitor gets almost every point wrong.
The documentary's furious emotional center is the disclosure of Ed's secretive birth at the St. Joseph's Mission Residential School, where he was subsequently abused, to a mother who was raped by a priest. Only the chance discovery of the newborn by a milkman saved him from the infanticide that befell other such unwanted babies.
Let's take a moment and just go through this statement. Ed's secretive birth? But everyone knew about Ed's birth. It was in the newspaper. Where he was subsequently abused? Ed never attended St. Joseph's. He went to Indian day school and public school. Born to a mother who was raped by a priest? No. Ed was born to a man named Ray Peters, who had 7 other children with his mother. The milkman saved him from the infanticide that befell others? No. It was Ed's mother who put baby Ed in the garbage burner. There is no evidence that any babies were ever incinerated at St. Joseph's Indian Residential School. Imagine, all these film critics are relaying lies. This is a continuation of the great Canadian phantom genocide, a story that had rocked the world 3 years before. On May 27th, 2021, the world was shocked by a single tweet. Headlines exploded around the world. Not one journalist had any questions. This is the era of repeaters, not reporters. Prestigious papers and news outlets repeatedly echoed the story. Former students who used to make up stories about a graveyard in the orchard were aghast to learn that bodies were supposedly been found.
We understand that you had heard rumors about this mass grave when you were a student there.
There was rumors of a graveyard, but nobody seemed to know where it was, and we didn't even know if it was true. And there was a big orchard there, and we used to make up stories about the graveyard being in the orchard.
Why would children have made up stories about a graveyard there? Perhaps because shortly after the school was built, in the 1920s, thousands of feet of septic trenches were dug for the sewage waste disposal bed, which now lies under the orchard in the area where bodies were said to be found by ground-penetrating radar. Canada, formerly a respected global peacekeeper, was now reviled as a pariah, a state-sanctioned, church-operated murderer of hapless Indigenous children. Allegedly, the numbers in the thousands, despite there being no excavations, no exhumations, no human remains found. reporters and experts all assumed the claims were true. But from the beginning, there was never even a list of names of supposed victims or missing persons. No names. At all. Allegedly, the children's bodies abandoned in mass graves, who some said had been dug by 6-year-olds for their classmates, who were children as young as 3. Canadian taxpayers had just spent $60 million and 6 years on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The commission found that over the 113 years of operation of Indian residential schools, serving some 150,000 students, only 423 children had actually died at the schools. Most of the children died of TB. Tuberculosis was a global plague.
These facts are laid out in the Truth and Reconciliation reports. Reporters never looked for the facts. They looked for atrocity headlines.
These news stories shattered Canada's sense of self. Canada's flag flew at half-mast for 6 months. Canada Day celebrations were cancelled. 215 pairs of empty children's shoes started popping up at provincial legislatures and city halls across Canada, as if a Holocaust had happened. The only thing missing to make the Holocaust genocide analogy complete was ashes. And the Williams Lake Band was about to supply those ashes with the stories told in Sugarcane.
The most believable lies contain an element of truth.
There was a Father O'Connor at St. Joseph's Indian Residential School in the 1960s. He broke his vows of celibacy and fathered a child with Phyllis Bobb, a woman who was a 22-year-old seamstress at the school, but not a student. The baby was put up for adoption. Phyllis had been a founding member and later pipe major of the Caribou Indian Girls Pipe Band, of which she was extremely proud. Some 20 years later, in the 1990s, a number of former students charged Father O'Connor with rape and molestation during his time at St. Joseph's in the 1960s. The trial dragged on for many years until the parties agreed to engage in an Aboriginal healing ceremony and a public apology by O'Connor to the community. Charlene Bello was one of the tribal leaders at the ceremony. According to the National Truth and Reconciliation file on Caribou's St. Joseph's Indian Residential School, charges against Bishop O'Connor were ultimately stayed.
In the documentary Sugarcane, the story of Father O'Connor and Phyllis Bobb and their baby gets conflated with an entirely different story in order to create the infanticide and genocide ashes theme. The filmmakers exploit the tragic true story of a key figure of the film.
The 1959 birth of Archie Noyes Cat and the actions of his unwed mother. There was a famous news story in the Williams Lake Tribune, August 26, 1959, of a baby found in the garbage burner of St. Joseph's Indian Residential School. St. Joseph's was near the Sugarcane Indian Reserve. The baby's mother was from Canim Lake Reserve. Rumors proliferated for years in the indigenous communities that priests had impregnated girls and then disposed of the unwanted babies in the school incinerator. Residential schools turned into crematoriums, babies to ashes. The final proof of the Canadian genocide, and that's where the bitter roots of Sugarcane begin. Sugarcane is a new independent documentary, produced and directed by investigative journalist Emily Cassie and co-directed by Julian Brave Noyes Cat, who is a descendant of people who attended St. Joseph's Indian Residential School. According to media interviews, when Emily Cassie first heard the devastating news of the Kamloops Indian band finding human remains, reportedly the bodies of 215 missing children in unmarked graves, often referred to as mass graves, in the orchard near the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, she was gut-pulled to the story.
So I was gut pulled when I heard about the 215 potential unmarked graves. I'm an investigative journalist and a filmmaker, and I have made docs and multimedia stories in the context of newsrooms for the last decade about human rights abuses and genocide all over the world, from Afghanistan to Rwanda. But I'd never turned my lens on my own country and the horrors that it perpetrated against its First Peoples.
The Kamloops band reported that a ground-penetrating radar search and several experts had confirmed their findings. In fact, ground-penetrating radar can only identify anomalies or ground disturbances which could be roots, rocks, old excavation, or which could be graves. But ground-penetrating radar cannot see coffins or bodies or human remains. For that, you have to excavate.
Right after Kamloops made their claim of finding the remains of 215 children, various other First Nations began popping up with similar claims of unmarked graves. Numbers quickly rose into the thousands.
It should be noted that most claims were made about old community graveyards where the wooden crosses or headboards had disintegrated over time. Most bodies there would be of European pioneer families. When children died at Indian residential schools or hospitals, death certificates show that their bodies were sent home for burial on their reserves. But no one is looking for their graves there, where many graves and markers have not been kept up. Here's an example. Gladys Chapman of Lytton was a student at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Gladys became ill and was treated, but died at Royal Inland Hospital in Kamloops, BC. Her death certificate shows that her body was returned to her family at the Spasm Indian Reserve, and she was buried there. It should be noted that to this date, no graves have been exhumed in order to confirm these numbers. About the time of the Kamloops First Nations claim of unmarked graves, about 300 kilometers north of Kamloops, the Williams Lake First Nation was also looking for children they claimed were missing or murdered at the Caribou Indian Residential School, commonly known as St. Joseph's Indian Residential School. Emily Cassie, director of Sugarcane, wanted to do a documentary and found this news story about Williams Lake, about to engage in a similar search to that of the Kamloops band. It was serendipity. Cassie contacted Julian Brave Noisecat, whom she had worked with at Huffington Post, to tell him about her contact with Chief Sellers and invite Julian to be part of the documentary, presumably as a writer and storyteller. To her surprise and his, it turned out that Cassie had fallen upon the one Indian band in Canada whose residential school history was deeply intertwined with the family history of Julian Brave Noisecat.
And as you might imagine, I nearly fell out of my chair, and then I said, "Wow, that's really crazy. Did you know that's the school that my family was taken away to and where my father was born?" So out of 139 Indian residential schools across Canada, Em happened to choose the one school, without knowing it, where my father's life began.
As it turned out, Julian's own father, who'd been found in the garbage burner at St. Joseph's Indian Residential School, his father was born there, at the school. Was he the son of a Roman Catholic priest? The baby in the garbage burner story had been major news in the Williams Lake Tribune. Everyone knew about it then, and everyone should know the story to this day. Julian's grandmother spent a year in jail for abandoning his father as a baby in the garbage burner at St. Joseph's Indian Residential School. Meanwhile, Julian's father, Ed Archie Noisecat, the baby, was mostly raised by Alice Archie, baby Ed's grandmother and grandfather. Sadly, they were both alcoholics.
Alice Archie died in 1967 when Ed was about 8 years old.
A turning point in the lives of these young filmmakers was when a woman named Charlene Bellow had taken Julian to the old barn, which was still standing on the St. Joseph's Indian Residential School site. Both Julian and Cassie were at the site, doing research in 2021. Charlene asked Emily Cassie to bring her camera and join them, and there in the dim barn light, Charlene conducted a smudging ceremony for Julian, invoking the spirits of the ancestors and missing children, entrusting Julian with the mission of witnessing the history of his people for the world to see. The filmmakers said it was as if the world broke open for their project. By happy coincidence, Williams Lake First Nation has its own archaeological excavation enterprise, Sugarcane Archaeology, established in 2016. Though it is unclear if Sugarcane Archaeology established the investigative team or whether the filmmakers framed the story this way, an investigative duo made up of Indigenous rights activist Charlene Bellow and Whitney Spearing, archaeologist with Sugarcane Archaeology, drive the main story narrative in Sugarcane. Thus, the documentary Sugarcane follows the work of Charlene and Whitney as they attempt to find out the unmarked graves where the missing children lie on the St. Joseph's Indian Residential School grounds. There's only one thing wrong with this picture, something that is not revealed in the documentary.
The fact is that investigator Charlene Bellow knew from the get-go who the father of the baby left in the garbage burner was, and she knew the mother and her circumstances as well.
Charlene and Julian and the woman who had the baby are all related. And the father was not a priest, but an Indigenous man named Ray Peters, a man who was 11 years older than the mother. He had 7 other children with Ed's mother. In fact, he fathered 17 children in total with 5 different women. Why was this fact never brought up in the documentary? Keep in mind that the filmmakers spent a lot of time on the reservation compiling research.
We lived the story. We lived in the community for 3 years. We were there for every moment. We built trust and respect and had, a reciprocal relationship. And we experienced some of the most extraordinary moments of our lives.
Emily Cassie and Julian Brave Noisecat and Julian's aunt, Charlene Bellow, framed the story as if Roman Catholic priests fathered babies and disposed of the unwanted babies in the St. Joseph's garbage burner, which they repeatedly refer to as an incinerator in the documentary. Based on film critic reviews, most reviewers believe that Julian's father was the illicit love child of a Roman Catholic priest at the school. This would be highly unlikely, since students were only allowed to attend Indian residential schools until they were 16 years old. Baby Archie Noisecat's mother was 20 years old at the time. In fact, Ed's mother had lived away from Canham Lake Reserve and had studied practical nursing in Vancouver. It seems that the only reason why baby Ed Archie was born at St. Joseph's School was that she was on her way home from Williams Lake to Canham Lake. It is possible that Ed's mother went into labour along the way and she pulled into a familiar place for help. But it was night time and summer, with few people on site. These are the facts no one knows but baby Ed's mother, and she did not want to talk about it. Baby Ed's mother had taken a practical nursing course and was able to deliver the baby herself. She dumped baby Ed there at St. Joseph's Indian Residential School in the garbage burner. In court, she later testified that she thought the baby was dead. These are the bitter roots of Sugarcane, a community willing to exploit one of their own family's tragic stories of many years ago, as if evidence for the phantom genocide of nameless children, knowingly misleading the viewers, knowingly placing a blood libel on the Roman Catholic Church and St. Joseph's Indian Residential School and staff, knowingly accusing Canada of genocide. Over 100 churches were burned down or vandalized in the years following the Kamloops claim of unmarked graves. What kind of violent reaction will there be to false claims of priest burning babies in incinerators, as claimed in Sugarcane?
We told governments, we told churches, our children never came home. They never believed us. Now we know.
There is no list of names of missing children. Ground-penetrating radar can't find bodies, only anomalies. If no one can name anyone, if the families have not filed missing persons reports over the past 113 years, then what we know is that this is a phantom genocide born of bitter roots and vengeance. Knowingly turning on the very facility that took her in, when Charlene, orphaned as a child, she suffered the loss of her father at Christmas time. His death certificate ascribes his death to a vehicle rollover. Charlene ascribes it to her dad was dead from drinking. That's another secret never told in Sugarcane, that a river of alcohol runs through the tragic lives of the communities and individuals involved in this film. She initially entered St. Joseph's in about grade 5. Her dad was already dead from drinking. She said, "So I knew how to protect myself and speak up for myself." It is curious that when Charlene testified to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1993, she said that her experience at St. Joseph's School was good, as was that of her mother and grandmother. There was no talk of missing or murdered children then. In the same 1993 hearings of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, many people like Elder Celine John, whose family all passed away, said her experience at residential school was the best time of her life. Many children who were orphaned were rescued by Indian residential schools. No wonder children might have lifelong impressions of graves and deaths after losing one or both parents. Then suddenly finding themselves in a school and never finding their parents again.
These ambiguous losses are the hallmark of prolonged and complicated grief, for which many people cannot find closure.
The treachery of these bitter roots is exceptional.
Years ago, in 1998, Charlene Below had been a key part of an Aboriginal healing circle related to Father O'Connor's transgressions.
On that day, BC Chief Charlene Bellow took part in a healing circle, tearfully saying she would not rest until every official who ever hurt a child at a residential school is brought to justice. In this CBC article, the filmmakers said discourse about Indian residential schools has waned over the past 3 years since the first announcements of unmarked burials found at residential school sites. Director Emily Cassie claims that her documentary insists we're not done with the truth. But the truth is hard to find in Sugarcane, especially about priests allegedly impregnating students and incinerating unwanted babies. The filmmakers then came up with another angle, that of the paternity of former Williams Lake First Nations chief Rick Gilbert. According to media interviews with Emily Cassie and Julian Brave Noisecat, Emily Cassie actually lived with Rick Gilbert and Anna Gilbert while making the film. She gained their trust. In an incredible scene, Rick Gilbert is shown a DNA test on a laptop in his home, reviewed by his wife Anna. It shows that Rick is 45% native. The balance is Irish and Scottish. A man by the name of Brian McGrath pops up on screen as a possible DNA cousin of Rick Gilbert. Then up pops a picture of Father McGrath, a former priest at the school. See, crows Anna, as if a common name is proof of paternity. Rick Gilbert was not convinced. He wanted more proof. Rick and his wife Anna were devout Roman Catholics. They had sheltered precious religious books and artifacts from the Catholic Church in their home when they feared someone might burn it down. Rick was born in 1946 to Elizabeth Agatha Thomas Gilbert. The ethnic origin of people in the Williams Lake area matches closely with Rick's white DNA. But his dad could have been any of the hundreds of handsome and hardy young men pouring into the Williams Lake region in the 1940s, looking for work. The documentary follows along as Chief Rick Gilbert and many other Indigenous leaders were invited to the Vatican to hear an apology from the Pope. It seems that Rick Gilbert had become convinced that he had been fathered by a priest, though no such evidence is presented in the film. The bitter roots of Sugarcane is that Emily Cassie exploited the questions about Rick's paternity to make the case for the film's thesis that priests impregnated girls at the school. In an emotional scene, Rick Gilbert confessed to Louis Lugen, Superior General of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate at the Vatican, that his mother was abused by a priest and thus he was fathered. This is very unlikely. Rick's mother was 18 when he was born in 1946, so she was not a student at the school. Students could only attend until age 16. In the end, Sugarcane is a bad case of family psychotherapy that would better have been conducted in a private office. The bitter roots of Sugarcane is that Charlene Bello was at the Aboriginal healing ceremony that was meant to end the painful issues between the Roman Catholic priest and the community. She was fully in support of it at the time, but she chose to reopen that community wound as if no one knew the details of the relationship. In such a small community, with a case stretching over many years, everyone knew everything.
The bitter roots of Sugarcane is that both the co-director, Julian Brave Noisecat, and his aunt, Charlene Below, knew very well what happened with baby Ed in the garbage burner.
The bitter roots of Sugarcane is that the woman who gave life to baby Ed,
A woman who spent a year in jail for a terrible mistake and had that scar torn open for all to see.
because in Canada, there's a movement to try and claim that Canada is guilty of genocide, but it is a phantom genocide. for which there is no list of names of missing persons. Sugarcane is a blood libel against Roman Catholics, Canadian history, and Canadians today. It is a shockumentary, but certainly not a documentary, because to be a documentary, facts matter.
Within less than a month of the Kamloops' claim of finding remains of 215 children, Canada passed the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP. For several months prior, UNDRIP had been opposed by 6 provinces and several First Nations bands. UNDRIP will upturn the Constitution of Canada. Existing property owners will be faced with land-back claims by Indigenous groups. The sugarcane producers included Julian and Ed singing a song. Canada is all Indian land. There's still no list of names of missing children. No names. At all.